the rhythmic and other distortions that words undergo in the mouths of EFL learners and such people. And you've also gathered by now that I like to start off with one or two little silly stories while the people who can't be punctual are coming along. Well, I'm afraid I'm not going to do that this morning because the whole lecture is entirely silly stories. But it's a very serious silliness, because what I want to point out to you is that when a speaker doesn't do the proper English language thing with a word, it's not a matter of nothing happening. There's not a vacuum. What does happen is, nearly always, that this person, by distorting the word or sentence he attempts to say, suggests something irrelevant, something other, something wrong, but definitely and positively, very often suggests something else. And now, one way of conveying this to you is, I have given a number of examples of the kind of thing that happens, and I have represented them in the sort of spelling they would have if they did exist, and of course some of them do, because sometimes there's a confusion, and a person says one word and sounds exactly as if he's saying another. I've given you an example of that already, haven't I? I've given you the word Russia, right? Which is the way that most EFL learners pronounce the name of the country, Russia. Of course, all native English speakers have a schwa vowel, a central vowel at the end of that word. Most non-native speakers tend to see the letter A and want to make it Russia. And as I told you, that is a totally different English word. Beautifully pronounced. If you habitually pronounce the name of that country Russia, then you don't use it for that country again, but keep it and save it and use it for the hour in the morning when people are hurrying to work, or the hour in the evening when they're hurrying away from work, the Russia. You've got a perfect pronunciation of that word there. So, you only need to do a little bit of redistribution of some of the things you say, and your English pronunciation will be excellent, won't it? Anyway, let's have a look at the categories I've put these into. I have called these things where you suggest something that you don't mean because you distort the English word. I've called them suggestionism, right? A little pet word of mine I've invented. Seems to fit me very nicely. And I point out that they don't only happen to EFL learners, EFL users. They happen between different varieties of English, or even between two people speaking the same variety of English. Sometimes I can feel that I've heard not the word that somebody meant to say to me. I've given an example in the first few lines here. Same pancrustation, for instance. I've heard somebody, well, goodness knows what same pancrustation means. A crustacean is a crab family creature, if you like. But I mean, I've heard some pancrustation sound like that from people whose accents are no different from my own. And there's a difference between North and South in England, for instance, where in the North, everybody pronounces the noun exporter as exporter. And the trouble with doing that, all right, I don't mind it doing it, there is an ambiguity when you, instead of saying exporter, as we usually do, they say exporter, and often they give quite a lot of stress to it, that X, then it could be something else. In other words, I actually heard a broadcast one night, a man had been detained by the police, he was arrested. Now, it gave his profession, and it said he was an exporter. Now, what am I to make of that? Does it mean that he imports and exports things, send things out of the country to sell them, or was he a former employee of the railways who carried people's luggage for them, carried their bags? That's what a porter did when we had them. We haven't got them much these days. So an exporter, most porters who have ever been porters are now exporters because they don't do it any longer. They can't get them to do it. Right, now, also, there's a north and south. There's also confusion, if you like, of a mild kind, occurs between British and American people. The first example I've got of this here is, I've been told that somebody woke up in New York, whatever it was. He had asked them to call him the following morning, and the his telephone rang in his hotel room, and he heard somebody say, "It's 8 o'clock." And of course he said, "I'm very sorry, madam, but I do not know anybody called Clark with or without the first name Ada." 8 o'clock is a perfect good American way to say it. There's nothing wrong with her pronunciation, but he didn't adjust very well, perhaps at that early hour of the morning, to hearing American English. And one of the things I want to emphasize to you is these are not so improbable that these confusions can occur as you might think. Because I find almost every week I come across in the newspaper, say, a word I've never seen before in my life, leave alone a pronunciation. I think almost every day I hear a pronunciation of some grouping of words, like a particular person's name. There are millions of person names and names of places, and it's not easy to pick them up first time. They suddenly absolutely mystified me. I'm a keen listener to weather reports, right? And about a few months ago, they suddenly had a new light vessel. It's called the Sandetti Automatic Light Vessel. These are the boats around the coast that are light ships and give signals to prevent boats going astray, going ashore and so on. So now when they did this, the first 3 or 4 times I heard it, with 3 or 4 different speakers, I didn't recognize it. I could not understand it. So don't you be discouraged if somebody says an English word to you and you don't recognize it. That's ordinary. It happens to us too. I was very confused and I could not decide what this word was until I'd heard it at least half a dozen times. Then I knew it was the Sandetti life vessel. But in fact, I've never seen this in print. I've looked it up in atlases and such books, and I can't find any trace of it. It's come up, it's appeared from nowhere. Unfortunately, having heard it from a variety of people now, I'm confident about how it should be spelt, or at least how it should be spoken. But initially I wasn't. So we can get all these confusions. It is confusing to hear something you've never heard before. This is why if you're a teacher, I should recommend you never to try and teach by saying words to your pupils only. Always help them by showing them the written form. If a word is new to your pupils, you should never let them just listen to it. It's very hard, listening and recognizing things. And I say we get plenty of misconceptions and misunderstandings between native English speakers, especially with our ridiculously silly vowel system. We've got far too many vowels, and they get in the way of each other. People who've known each other all their life can still mishear a word. Words like, particularly if they contain the vowel of cup and the vowel of camp, for instance. As a matter of fact, a lady very close to me once went into a shop in London, and she wanted to buy a present for a baby. And she said, I'd like to see. It's not surprising that people will get little misconceptions that you are trying to say something different from what you are saying. Now, the last thing in my first paragraph, there's a reference to the late Kingsley Amis. As he had a lot of fun out of this. He is a brilliant writer, many of us, a very funny writer, I found, and one of the comic devices he uses is to use distorted spelling to suggest the way people pronounce words oddly, and very cleverly too, because I find I can immediately recognize the sort of thing he's getting onto. And so he uses, to quite an extent, these suggestionisms, as I call them. And I'll give him one example of the ones he does. He has a very nice little passage about a British Council lecture in his novel, I Like It Here. Not a very good novel, but this little bit of it is quite good. I Like It Here, set in Portugal. Anyway, he has this British Council lecture, and somebody gets up at the end of the lecture, or in the middle of it, whatever it was, and says, what about your Evelyn Gough and your Edgecrumb? And because she wasn't pronouncing them very well, she meant Evelyn War and A.J. Cronin, Edgecrumb. And when he didn't react and understand Edgecrumb, she said, cities are sitting down. And of course I've written that up to you just as it's written in the book, in the last line but one of that first paragraph. Cities are sitting down. That, of course, is the keys of the kingdom. But that's spoken with a rather Latin or French rhythm. So there we are. Now, there's the kind of topic and the kind of distortion I'm talking about. And now I go on to the first group of words. And this concerns that suffix or ending R, right? Now, one of the interesting things about the English language is we've got lots of alternative pronunciations. But curiously enough, although we have thousands of words in English that end in the letter A, thousands of words, all the names of countries usually have A at the end of them, and lots of scientific words because these A's come from Latin and Greek. And we've got many, many such words, but there's only one I know of that has an alternative pronunciation from the pronunciation with schwa, and that only one is the word cinema. The word cinema can either be pronounced cinema or cinema. If you want to. To me, it sounds a little bit elegant to pronounce cinema, but I hear it every day because it's my wife's habitual pronunciation of it, so fair enough, it's commonplace enough. And you use either, but in no other word may you commit yourself to use R for that final sound. And I'd be very surprised if not the majority of you have many words which you treat in that way. All right, let's look then at the second paragraph in number 2 here, in section number 2, and see what happens of the visual picture in the mind of the English speaker who hears somebody saying R at the end of these things. Africa comes out like Africa. America comes out Africa. America. Asia comes out like Asia. And Jamaica comes out like Jamaica. Jamaica. You come from Jamaica. Jamaica, that sort of thing, yeah. Jamaica and Jamaica sound very similar there. And I've already mentioned Russia, and then there's some names, an awful lot of particularly girls' names. You've got the lady who died recently, Ella Fitzgerald. Well, if you call her not Ella Fitzgerald, Ella Fitzgerald, you sound as if you're talking about some author whose first initials are L and R. So Ella Fitzgerald becomes Ella, Emma Bovary becomes M.R. Bovary, and Jessica Jones becomes Jessie Carr Jones. Very common type of thing, that kind of double barrel surname. And Julia Jones becomes Julie R. Jones. So there you are, false suggestion. Oh, and I've added that little children are very fond of using this kind of thing. They're very aware of the kind of mistakes people make, and they make little riddles out of them. There's the one, a child asks another, what is a dogma? Right? Distorting the pronunciation, of course, for the benefit of the joke, and the answer is a bitch with a litter of puppies. The mother of the dog. So. Well, that's one group there you have to be careful of. Another group, another suffix, another ending is the ending Asian. And very often I hear this Asian ending being given not the schwa vowel, or rather the syllabic end that it usually does have from native English speakers, but having shone. Now, shone is actually the past tense of the verb to shine. In British English anyway, in American English it's a bit more regularly translated past tense. In American it's shown. In British English it's shone. And so when I hear people say things that in shone, it sounds like a sentence in which the verb is shone and they're referring to some person. Because this could happen. When we talk about somebody doing well in an exam, you say, oh yes, I'm sure he'll shine in the exam. And after you say, oh yes, he shone in that exam. He did very well. So here are all these people then who have been shining in their examinations. There's a list of them. Accommodation or accommodation, right? Adjudication, right? Affiliation, annihilation, another double-barrel name for you. Anticipation, association or association, collaboration or collaboration or collaboration, which sounds very convincing kind of word. It might well mean something like that. Yeah. Consideration, determination or determination, there you are, determination. Elimination and examination or examination or illumination or negotiation, which was, I've told you about the overlapping between our lectures. That was an example given by Professor Wells yesterday morning, was negotiation. Warned you about saying negotiation. negotiation or negotiation is what's preferred, with a more leisurely vowel sequence, not reducing, not weakening it to compressing it to a yod there. Right, a few more examples of weak syllables made strong then. You will hear a lot about Daniel Jones as you're in the department founded by Daniel Jones. So here are some of the ways that people sound when they say Daniel Jones, for instance. Danielle Jones, or Danielle Jones, as if it was a lady with the name Danielle. Stephen Jones, there was a Stephen Jones here too. Stephen Jones, the passed on letters, oh well, yes, all right. The familiarity. I often hear this word familiarity with the wrong vowel in the first syllable. It begins with a schwa, right? Familiarity. Or just say the F and forget the vowel altogether, right? The familiarity. If you say familiarity, now it sounds like some ridiculous family. And arity, I've never met a family called arity, but if anybody said there was a family in Ireland called arity, I would believe it completely. It sounds like a typical Irish name, arity. I know why, because I've heard names like McGarity, right? Which sounds as if it's the son of arity. So, yes, it sounds very, very odd, but convincing, that does. Oh, now there's two kinds of oratory, or oratory. Laboratory, yes, instead of laboratory. And Amen for All Seasons, the title of that play, film. And Lord Snowdon. Lord Snowdon. How ridiculous. You don't reduce that final syllable in Snowdon and you call him Lord Snowdon. It sounds quite ridiculous. So, I mean, it sounds as if he's out in a blizzard somewhere. So, going to carefully to paragraph 5 or section 5, I've got some examples of the way greetings are distorted. Here we are then. I once used to live in a house in Cambridge where I think he was Latvian or something, my landlord, but he greeted me very charmingly, but very, very foreignly, and he would say things like, how do you do? Good morning. Good afternoon. Because that sounds a bit Spanish. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good evening. That's what he used to say. Good evening. And I always got this picture. Goody is a thing you'll come across in Shakespeare. It's a term of address to a grandmother in Shakespeare. Goody. So then in could easily be a double-barreled name. The surnames then and in both exist, right? So good evening sounds like talking to somebody else, not me. What is the time? Yes. 11 o'clock. Ella, we've got another Ella now. We had Ella Fitzgerald now. We've got 11 o'clock. Which of course is 11 o'clock. Yeah. It's 7 o'clock. It's 7 o'clock that time. Yes. Sounding like some French place. And another quotation for children have fun out of this phenomenon too. They ask each other riddles like, knock, knock, who's there? Mandy. Mandy who? Mandy lifeboat, this ship is sinking. So, Spanish speakers have got to be careful of that kind. Well, I'm going over to the other side now. And you've heard Professor Wells, I think, talk about free-fortis splitting. That's the expression they use in this department for shortening, reducing of vowels or other things that precede one of the sharp consonants, the 8 ones, patakacha, patasha, patakacha, patasha. Those 8, if they occur in a word, and there's something coming before them, any vowel will be reduced, clipped as Professor Wells calls it, any vowel will be reduced in length, any consonant will be shortened too. The L in health, for instance, or the N in length is much shorter than the corresponding things without a following them. The L in hell is quite long, health is quite short. In sing, the N is quite long, but in length it's quite short. Right, now what have we got then? Oh, yes. These references to Hebrew gentlemen. When people want apple juice and orange juice, but they talk about apple juice and orange juice. And orange juice, of course, has a double problem, doesn't it? Because they're not releasing the j at the end of orange. You can't leave that out, or you can't simplify. Apple juice and orange juice instead of apple juice and orange juice. A gruesome sight comes out like a gruesome sight, yes. But for the grey, soft God, instead of but for the grace of God. And now, hoping, some Chinaman is, I am hoping, if you're hoping. It sounds like you're a Chinaman. Because that's exactly what you're doing, you see. Hoping has to be, have the vowel shortened. But then you recognize that you've got a single word, that it's a rhythmic group. But if you destroy the little pattern and you turn it into the pattern of the rhythm of 2 separate words, then you've begun talking Chinese instead of English. Right, so not hoping then, but hoping. And not seeking, but seeking. Seeking and sealing, of course, are perfectly good expressions, but there's something else. Sea-Link is the name of a ferry company, I think. But I've heard that said by my famous landlord. He was trying to say the word ceiling, the roof, right? Not ceiling. And there's the whole King family. Now, in the King family, Ma and Pa are all right. Mother and father are okay. But marking and parking, you don't notice much any great difference of length in the R there. But in the other people in this family, the baby, Lee, who is Lee King, the baby Lee, the comedian Joe, the gardener Ray, the counterfeiter Fay, the creative May, and the Scandinavian cousin Vi, they turn up in EFL as Lee King instead of Lee King. Joe King. When people say to me, you must be joking, they say, I say, certainly not. My name is not King at all, and my first name is not Joe. I often have that said. It's not joking, but joking. Yes, Joe King instead of joking, Ray King instead of raking, Fay King instead of faking, May King instead of making, and Vi King instead of Viking. So you've got to get the rhythm of those right. And by the way, Nosmo is not a serious reference at all. Nosmo is what you read on railway carriages, you know? Nosmo King? No? I don't know how to express it. Silly. Right. Section 7 then, tonic misplacement. Here are some other things I've heard. I will speak to one of my colleagues. The word, I know in most other languages, you have a stress on the second syllable of colleague, but in English it's on the first. It's not colleague, but colleague. Right? Eloquence instead of eloquence. Periodical. I heard this from a lecturer, a poor lady who's now deceased, I'm afraid. She was a Finnish lecturer, lecturing to an audience of English speakers, and she kept on talking about periodical. And I mean, I've heard of various Irish pop groups, right? Called the old this and the old that. So periodical, well, the pericomo, it sounded like it was some pop singer. Until I gradually dawned, I didn't even recognize the word in the first once or twice she said it, but eventually I realized she must have meant periodical. But that's a big distortion. Events which occurred recently, oh well, that's a typical kind of thing. Her health as weekend, well, not weekend, weakened is the word that person wanted. Her health is weakened. Adrenaline instead of adrenaline. I've heard that from Hungarian speakers who put the stress too early. A mechanical or mechanical. Mechanical. This sounds something to do with the Muslim world and metals at the same time. No, not mechanical. A mechanical program. Sarah Constance. Or Sarah Constance. No, we don't talk about circumferences, although I have heard it. In fact, almost any distortion you could predict is possible in English word, you'll hear, if you keep your ears up, you'll hear it sometime or other from some kind of speaker. I've even heard things like the first syllable apparently being stressed, apparently. Heard that. You can just hear anything you like if you're paying attention. Now, in the end of this paragraph, of this section, I've slipped in a quotation from the Bible because I like to strike a serious note now and again. And we have this rather amusing thing that occurred in the Bible. You know, when the Bible was translated, first of all, they found that they had to make sense of it, they had to introduce some words that weren't really in the original text. So they hit on the device, and it's still carried on in most Bibles that are printed today, hit on the device of putting the words that weren't in the original text in italics, so that people would know that they were putting it to make the meaning clearer. But the trouble is, italics has another major use, and that is for emphasis, isn't it? So this is how this is in danger of being read back by by the uninitiated. And he spake to his son, saying, Saddle me the ass. And they saddled him. And that didn't saddle the father. The father was speaking to his son. That treated him as an ass, if you like. Well, not intended, but please take note, that is a very commonplace EFL mistake to do that. I would expect the average Spanish student to say it exactly like that, without the italics on here tonight, because Spanish students are naturally in the habit of doing what they do in Spanish, going to the end of the sentence and put their stress on the last word. You can't do it in English. Again and again, with particular pronouns, you have to avoid stressing such a word and stress something earlier. And this is demonstrated in some of his compounds here too. Compounds of any, some, and self are particularly often stressed. He hurt himself or himself? No, he hurt himself. I want to ask you something? Nonsense. No, I want to ask you something is what they want to say. I want to ask you something. Means I'm scratching my head to find something to ask you, to delay you or something. There's a possible meaning, but a very unlikely situation suggested. Let's ask someone? No, let's ask someone. And we must ask somebody. Well, you don't ask a corpse. Ask somebody. Something. Have you lost something? No. Have you lost something, you have to say. And if it's like a drink, not I love one, unless, of course, you're driving, I suppose one is the limit. But normally, I love it. I love it. There you go. And now I've got some distortions of a few politicians' names to attract humor. Mrs. Sedgemoor, Mrs. Thatcher. You can perhaps recognize the language in some cases. The distortion comes wrong. Mr. Major, Mr. Harold Macmillan, Mr. Harold Macmillan, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wilson, Sir Winston Churchill, Sir Winston Churchill, President Clinton, President Clinton, and President Kennedy. President Kennedy. Okay. And then I have some distortions of universities out. Aberdeen, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Essex. As a matter of fact, I once was asking a student where he'd been before, and it always comes back to me when I read this, and I said, well, this is not the first British university you've been to, weren't you somewhere else? I don't know where it was. He said, yes, I was in a sex university. I've heard of universities tending to specialize, but that really so, Essex University, Manchester, Red Ink University, that's quite was they all right with red coloured ink and Red Ink University, Exeter for Exeter, Liverpool for Liverpool, Oxford, very Spanish that, Oxford, Cambridge for Cambridge, Bristol, Brentford, University College London. That's another one. That's it. You read it after that. It's very good. Okay. So, and now, some miscellaneous items. I've heard if the children's food come out, it eats the children's food. And it's a quite good example here. You all know the aspiration of tea rule, that you aspirate the tea at the beginning of the stress level. And if you want to say a tanker at anchor, then you've got both types in one phrase, although the actual phonemes are repeated set. So a tanker at anchor, notice when I say tanker, aspirate the tea, at anchor, when the T belonged to the previous word, the at, I didn't aspirate. A tanker at anchor, or the D at anchor. But of course, if you do as some people do, they get very good at aspirating English tea, and they aspirate all of it. But that won't do. You can't sort of be aspirating all the time. You have to remember the rule is when it begins to stress so. So they say, instead of saying a tanker at anchor, they say a tanker at tanker. And of course, they're just saying a tanker twice, which is not good enough, right? Okay? I get a potato, there is such a thing as a potato block. I get a potato block. Another over-enthusiastic aspiration. I get a potato block. meant to say what time they arise from their bed. But of course, what it means is they receive, and actually I don't know how they work, but children have some way of telling the time by sticking something in a potato. Somebody explained it to me one day, but they really do exist, potato pots. And there you are, but don't get up at that time for that meeting, right? A beaky pear. Well, the pear will have beaky people with big noses, like birds. Right? But this is, of course, typically French, isn't it? Or a beekeeper, or many other continental stuff. A beekeeper instead of a beekeeper. Development. Oh dear, the number of times I've heard the word development with the stress on the first syllable. Goodness knows why. It's a favourite one for EFL users to distort the rhythm of. But development, develop, stress on the second syllable, that's the only possibility. Jacques Zidupert, Jacques Zidupert, Jacques Zidupert, Frank Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, Frank Sinatra, there's a Spanish one, Frank Sinatra, losing her consonants, yeah. Frank Sinatra. And this one, I'm afraid. I wish somebody could tell me that people say this to me all the time. They say, I'm afraid. I say, well, I'm a Jackson. The word afraid is never pronounced with the F verb. I think perhaps they're getting confused with the word said. Now, the past tense of the word to say, and the present tense is said with the F verb. The past tense of say is said, although it's spelled S-A-I-D. But afraid is never pronounced by native English speakers anywhere. Fred, right? It's pronounced Fred, and of course it does sound this rather. I called my poor little dog Fred because I thought he was a very undistinguished, very unaristocratic name because he was a very unaristocratic dog. Anyway, oh yes, people confuse the word international with international, yeah? And they talk about the beginning, but they say the beginning, and in the shed is a quotation from Maurice Chevalier. You know Maurice Chevalier, the famous French singer and actor? English speakers love French accents. You know, they're very fond of. My mother used to say, "Oh, I do love broken English." And what she meant was a heavy accent in English. And she particularly liked people like Charles Boyer and Maurice Chevalier. Maurice Chevalier, then, this French actor, he sings a song in, I think it's that famous Gigi film, one of his films anyway, in which he says, I'm glad I'm not young anymore, you know? And he sings, it's so nice to be in the shed. And of course the shed is a little wooden house in the garden where you keep the gardening tools. So it sounded so romantic. And it came out very ridiculous. He wasn't in the shed, he was in the shade. Out in the shade of the fierce heat of the sun. So, and he's not the only one who does that sort of thing, so be careful of those. Okay? I've got one or two more names here now. Eastwall instead of, or Eastro instead of Heathrow. Gatwick instead of Gatwick. Stenstead or Sternested, very Spanish, for Stansted. Basingstoke for Basingstoke. Canterbury Cathedral, or Canterbury Cathedral, Canterbury, that's the typical Spanish. It's the official Spanish way of saying it. You even write it with no R in Spanish. But anyway, we don't pronounce it though. It's Canterbury, not Canterbury. Yeah. Okay. Canterbury Cathedral. What else have we got here? Half der Schiff, or after shave, after eight, or after eight, for after eight. No. McDonald, or McDonald, for McDonald. Joseph Conrad, for Joseph Conrad. Macbeth, for Macbeth. Shakespeare, or Shakespeare. You've got a very unsophisticated Spanish word. For Shakespeare. Zentwich, or Songlish, or Sandwich. And finally, I think use of some London locality. Now, here's the kind of distortion that can happen. Cicron Chus, the crown jewel. The Tower of London, very German. The Tower of London. Baker Street, Baker Street. Guggenempellis, Selfridges. Notice I've noted before you did Selfridges, Nothing else. Paddington or Paddington. Paddington is not Spanish, Paddington is obviously very German. Hammersmith, Kensington or Kensington or Kensington, Kensington, the Strand, if you're German, the Strand, if you're Spanish, the Strand. The changing of cigar, the changing of guard, King's Cross or King's Cross, the Spanish, or King's Cross, Leicester Square, the Alberto, the Albert Hall, the Festival Hall, the Festival Hall, like that. The British Museum, Piccadilly or Piccadilly or Piccadilly, Piccadilly, Washington or Washington, Tottenham Court Road or Tottenham Court Road, Tottenham Court Road, Trafalgar Square, Victoria or Victoria, Waterloo or Waterloo, Waterloo, and Hittencourt or Hittencourt, and Hampton Court. Well, I've enjoyed it.